A couple of weeks ago, a high-voltage power line to the Dnepropetrovsk nuclear power plant was damaged following Ukraine's armed forces shelling. This led to a cessation of external power supply to the station. By covering up such terrorist acts, the Kyiv regime, along with the EU and NATO countries, not only encourage Ukraine to launch new strikes on peaceful nuclear facilities, but also become direct accomplices to them. The European Union does not cease its attempts to find additional resources to support the Zelensky regime. This was one of the key points on the agenda of the informal EU summit, which took place on October 1st in Copenhagen. Brussels intends to address it by using so-called frozen Russian sovereign assets. According to the European Commission's plan, €140 billion are to be allocated to the Kyiv regime as an interest-free loan, which it is unlikely to ever return. Why? Because the main condition for repayment is an utterly unrealistic demand for, as stated, reparations from Russia to Ukraine. In the upside-down world of the EU and NATO, perhaps that makes sense. But we are in reality. And we know that Brussels has long been actively stealing income from blocked Russian assets. They come up with various justifications, invent different formulas. Now they've invented this reparation, but the essence remains the same: to steal Russian sovereign assets. In the upside-down world of the EU and NATO, perhaps that makes sense. But we are in reality, and we know that Brussels has long been actively stealing income from blocked Russian assets. They come up with various justifications, invent different formulas. Now they've invented this reparation, but the essence remains the same: to steal Russian sovereign assets. In the upside-down world of the EU and NATO, perhaps that makes sense. But we are in reality, and we know that Brussels has long been actively stealing income from blocked Russian assets. They come up with various justifications, invent different formulas. Now they've invented this reparation, but the essence remains the same: to steal Russian sovereign assets. Since 2022, the European Union has assisted Ukraine by providing €178 billion. How many citizens of various nationalities, of different civil affiliations living in these territories, were killed for this? The European Union does not mention. 63 billion accounts for direct military aid. At the EU summit in Copenhagen on October 1st, European leaders once again demonstrated that their response to the continued conflict in Ukraine is not diplomacy, but escalation. End of quote. Yes, indeed. Nowadays, in the positions of Eurodiplomats, you find either real schemers and fraudsters, whom the EU justice system should be interested in, or absolute laymen, people who have no idea what diplomacy is, placed there specifically so they won't ask questions. Despite logic and facts, he stated that aiding Kyiv is, in his words, support for peace, not war. But how does that happen? Money goes directly to war efforts. Rhetoric is aggressive, yet they claim to uphold peace. He called for continued military, political, and economic support to the Kyiv regime and mobilization for strengthening collective European defense in the face of a Russian threat. First, they conjured this threat, plastered it all over their corridors and meeting halls like wallpaper, then decided to strengthen this collective European security. Ukrainian social media is actively discussing the Kyiv intention to recruit about 1.5 million people into the armed forces of Ukraine. Who will these people be? They will be Ukraine's citizens. What ages? What condition? I mean health. No one will care. They will be thrown into the grinder of this very Western hell, which they, with Zelensky's hands, are creating on Ukrainian territory. We are outraged at the blatant Russophobia on display. The Australian authorities refused to issue visas to members of the state corporation Roscosmos delegation, led by CEO Dmitry Bakhanov. They were heading there to participate in the 76th International Astronautical Congress, IAC, in Sydney from September 29th to October 3rd. This event was scheduled to take place. We see another unfriendly action reflecting Canberra's blind allegiance to the short-sighted adventurist campaign of the collective West, unsuccessfully striving to implement our country's isolation. It won't work, but they at least want to spite us. The Western countries' policies over recent decades, despite their declarations of openness, are anything but open as they claim. That's a good question. Why? Because look at how they bizarrely combine everything. On the one hand, they start writing memoirs. For instance, the former German Foreign Minister Baerbock has acquired memoirs without even leaving her workplace. But on the other hand, crucial facts necessary for preventing escalation or an open conflict phase are being silenced. That's an excellent question. Let's direct it to them all. Why did Merkel stay silent? Why do they publish Baerbock's memoirs when they should be working, not self-aggrandizing? Why? It's a good question. I would also like to know the answer. What else will she disclose, or what else can she share on the stated topic? This extensive list of questions that we have, and we have been asking them, what happened with the Berlin patient? By the way, how did she feel after visiting his ward? The Russian president has clearly outlined our stance on such dangerous steps if they are implemented. Despite having significantly upgraded our air defense system, cruise missiles are powerful weapons, the acquisition of which by the Kyiv regime will lead to a new serious stage of escalation in the Ukrainian crisis, although won't alter the balance of power on the battlefield. The question is not so much about the Tomahawks being at the disposal of Ukraine's armed forces, but rather that their use without direct involvement of U.S. troops is simply impossible. The Russian leadership has repeatedly stated this. Corresponding U.S. administration's decisions, if ultimately made, would not only risk spiraling confrontation, but also inflict irreparable damage to Russian-U.S. relations, which are just now beginning to show elements of renewed dialogue. We are closely monitoring developments around this issue, calling for utmost restraint in handling this highly sensitive matter, which may significantly complicate the search for settlement on the Ukrainian track, and hope that our signals will be heard in Washington.